My brother crossed my name off his wedding guest list so slowly I could hear the pen scratching through every letter. Then he looked at me across our parents' kitchen table and said, "You're this family's biggest shame. I wish Mom and Dad had never brought you home. I'd rather be an only child than admit you're my sister." For 34 years, I had swallowed every reminder that I was the one who had been adopted. That afternoon, I felt the old instinct to beg for my place, and for the first time, I didn't obey it. I took the pen from Evan's hand, drew one black line through his name at the top of the page, and met his eyes. "You just erased the wrong person. If you've ever felt like you had to earn your place in a family, stay with me." 12 days before the wedding, I had gone to my parents' house expecting nothing more dramatic than coffee, takeout, and a final round of logistics. I had received my invitation weeks earlier and sent back my RSVP. My dress was hanging in my closet. Mom had even asked whether I wanted my hair done with the other women that morning, so when I sat at the kitchen table, I wasn't wondering whether I was invited. We were checking the final head count, the seating chart, and the family photo list before Evan sent everything to the coordinator. Mom, Carol, had covered the table with papers and sticky notes. Dad sat at the end with his reading glasses low on his nose. Evan had the cleanest copy in front of him and tapped his pen whenever one of us interrupted. I knew that tap. It meant he was irritated, but still willing to let the rest of us pretend he wasn't. I also knew my role. I moved my mug away from his papers. I let a sarcastic remark pass when his eyes flicked toward me. I told myself the same thing I had told myself for years. Don't make his day harder. That was what I did with Evan. I let things pass. Not because I was afraid of him, but because family peace had always felt like rent I was supposed to pay. I had entered that house at 8 years old, with a small bag and the habit of watching adults' faces before asking for anything. Carol and Thomas Hale had told me I was staying. They had told me I was theirs. I believed them. But some part of me never stopped believing that being chosen came with an obligation to be easy to keep. The trouble started when Evan reached the seating chart and asked why my name was at the family table. Mom answered as if the question were absurd, because that was where immediate family sat. Then he pulled the photographer's list closer and saw my name again under the small group marked for immediate family photos. He asked whether Mom had put me there too. Her mouth tightened. She's immediate family. The room went still. I didn't understand what was happening yet. Evan and I had been distant for years. He could be cold. He had used the word adopted to make a point more than once, but we still showed up to birthdays and holidays. Our relationship had become narrow and careful, and I had mistaken careful for intact. Evan uncapped his pen. At first I thought he was moving me to another table. Instead, he dragged a line straight through my name, then crossed me off the photo list. Mom snapped his name. I asked what he was doing, and he said he was fixing it. When I asked whether he meant the seating, he looked at me and said, "No, I'm changing the guest list." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. My RSVP was counted. The coordinator had my meal choice. "You're uninviting me 12 days before your wedding?" I asked. He said yes. Dad pushed his chair back and told him that was enough. But Evan had crossed some line inside himself before he ever crossed my name on paper. He said he was tired of pretending I belonged in every family space, just because Mom and Dad insisted on it. Then he looked straight at me and delivered the words that cut through 34 years of carefully maintained family rituals. "You're this family's biggest shame. I wish Mom and Dad had never brought you home. I'd rather be an only child than admit you're my sister." Mom made a sound like she had lost her breath and told him never to say that in her house. What struck me hardest was not even shame. It was "brought you home." For a heartbeat, I was 8 again. I could feel the rough handle of the little bag I had carried into this kitchen the first time. I remembered standing too close to the door because exits made me feel safer. I remembered Carol crouching so she wouldn't tower over me, and Dad putting my bag beside a chair because I did not have to keep holding it. I remembered the promise that followed. "You're here now. You don't have to worry about being sent away." 34 years later, my brother had found the oldest fear in me and spoken directly to it. My first instinct was painfully familiar. Fix it, calm him down, ask what I had done, offer to sit somewhere else. Skip the photographs. Tell him it was his wedding, and I understood. I had become very good at making myself smaller before anyone had to ask. Then Evan said, "You always gotta be the one everyone protected." Something in Mom's expression changed. It wasn't only anger. For one brief second, she looked stricken, almost guilty, in a way I didn't understand. Then she reached for the papers and demanded the list back. Evan pulled it away. Dad started saying his name in the warning tone I had heard all my life. The old machinery of our family was already turning. Dad would lower the temperature. Mom would demand an apology. Evan would dig in. And sooner or later, someone would look at me with the familiar request in their eyes. "Megan, please, help us get through this." I looked at the pen instead and took it from Evan's hand. At the top of the page, his name was written beside a note for the groom's final list. I drew one firm black line through it. I wasn't pretending I could remove him from his own wedding. I wasn't threatening him. For once, I simply returned the gesture instead of absorbing it. "You just erased the wrong person," I said. He stared at me as if he expected the rest a threat, a secret, some promise that I would make him sorry. I gave him nothing. I set down the pen, picked up my purse, and left the table. Mom and Dad followed me into the hallway, both trying to fix it before I reached the door. Mom said she would make Evan put my name back. Dad said he would talk sense into him after he cooled down. From the kitchen, Evan said something I couldn't make out, and Mom turned as if she were ready to go back and fight for me. I touched her arm and told her not to. She stared at me as though I had become the unreasonable one. I reminded her that it was Evan's wedding. If he did not want me there, I would not make them force him to invite me. Dad's jaw tightened, and he said maybe they should not go either. The offer warmed a frightened part of me more than I wanted to admit. I wanted them to choose me. I wanted Evan to see them choose me. That feeling scared me enough to answer carefully. "Please don't. Don't turn his wedding into a test because of me. And don't call him tonight trying to make him change his mind." Mom looked hurt and asked what they were supposed to do. For tonight, nothing. I left before I could change my mind. In my car, I sat with both hands on the steering wheel and listened to my breathing. I was not calm. I was not healed. I was not suddenly free of the need to belong. Part of me still expected my phone to ring before I got home, with Evan saying he had gone too far. It didn't. By evening, I had told no one what happened. I had not called a relative, posted online, or sent an angry text. I was standing in my kitchen when Mom's message lit up my phone. "Evan is calling relatives," she wrote. "He says he needs to explain everything before you tell your version." I read it twice. My version? I hadn't told anyone anything. The first message came before breakfast. It was from a relative I saw maybe 3 times a year, asking whether I was really refusing to attend Evan's wedding because he had asked for one day that wasn't about me. I stared at the words while my coffee cooled. By 9, there were 2 more. One asked if I was planning to show up anyway. Another said everyone was stressed enough and hoped I would not make the wedding a family statement. They sounded cautious, as if they had been warned that I might become a problem. I could have answered with the whole kitchen table scene. I could have typed exactly what Evan had said about wishing Mom and Dad had never brought me home. For a few minutes, I pictured how satisfying it would feel to put his own words in front of people before he could polish them. But if I started calling people one by one, I would spend the next week proving I deserved to be believed. So I used the same answer each time. Evan withdrew my invitation. I'm respecting his decision. I'm not going to disrupt the wedding. That simple answer did something Evan's version apparently had not prepared people for. One relative replied, "Then why did he say you were boycotting?" Another sent only, I see. I did not push either of them. Still, by lunchtime, I understood the shape of the story traveling ahead of me. According to him, the argument had not started because he crossed my name off a confirmed guest list. It had started because I expected special treatment, and when he finally set a boundary, I turned it into a crisis. My absence was being described as punishment. The line I had drawn through his name was being offered as proof that I wanted to ruin something for him. I set my phone face down and went through the day with the strange sensation of hearing people talk about a version of me who was always one room ahead. That version was louder than I was, more demanding, more calculating. She apparently wanted the family table as proof of rank. I had spent half my life trying not to become that kind of burden, which was probably why Evan's story landed so easily. He only had to lean on an old family assumption. When something went wrong between us, I would eventually be the one asked to smooth it over. Late that afternoon, Julia texted. We were friendly, but not close. Most of what she knew about Evan and me came from holidays, dinners, and whatever he had told her when I was not around. She said Evan had told her the conflict had gone too far, and because the wedding was so close, she needed to ask one direct question. Was there anything she should know about regarding safety, a confrontation at the venue, or someone planning to interrupt the ceremony? Humiliation moved through me all over again. Not because Julia was accusing me, but because my brother had somehow turned being uninvited into a question of whether I might need to be managed. I called her instead of texting a paragraph I would regret. I told her there was no threat, no plan, and no surprise appearance coming. I won't go where I'm not invited, I said, and I'm not going to interfere with your wedding. Julia was quiet for a beat, then said she appreciated me answering directly. She did not ask for evidence or press for details. That's all I needed to know, she said before we hung up. The call should have relieved me. Instead, it made the situation feel larger. Evan had not only decided I did not belong at his wedding, he was trying to make sure everyone understood that my exclusion was reasonable before anyone heard how it happened. I kept returning to the same question. If he had what he wanted, my name gone, my chair available, my face out of the family photographs, why was he still working so hard? Mom supplied part of the answer without meaning to. She called that evening and spent the first few minutes talking around the subject, telling me Dad was angry, Evan was stressed, Julia had enough on her plate, and everyone needed to calm down. I knew where the conversation was going before she got there. When she finally said, "Maybe you could call your brother," the old response rose in me automatically. Of course, I could call. I could keep my voice soft. I could tell Evan I understood it was his wedding. I could find the exact combination of apology and silence that would lower the temperature. I was halfway to saying yes when I stopped. Mom must have heard the silence because she added, "Just talk to him. We just need to get through the next week." There it was. The family rule I had obeyed so long I had stopped hearing it as a rule. Evan could ignite the room, but I was the one expected to carry water into it. "Mom," I said, "why am I always the one who has to make everything quiet again?" She did not answer. I heard a small sound in the background, maybe Dad moving through the kitchen. Then she said my name in a tired voice, but still no answer came. I told her I loved her and that I was not asking her to choose between us. I also told her I would not call Evan just to make the week easier for everyone else. When we hung up, my hands were shaking. Saying no had taken less than a minute. The guilt arrived almost immediately. The next morning, Evan contacted me himself. His message was controlled, almost businesslike. He said relatives were getting the wrong idea because I was refusing to explain my role in what happened. If I wanted people to stop misunderstanding him, there was an easy solution. I could admit that he had reasons for not wanting me seated with his family at the wedding. I read that sentence until the word family seemed to separate from the rest of it. Then I called him because I wanted to hear exactly what he meant. He answered on the second ring. I told him I was not asking anyone to misunderstand him. I had barely spoken to anyone. He said that was exactly the problem. By staying quiet, I was making him look cruel. If I defended myself, I was starting a campaign. If I stayed silent, I was supposedly manipulating people into judging him. Then he said, "All you have to do is acknowledge that I have a reason not to want you at the family table." There was no shouting in his voice. That made the sentence clearer, not softer. I asked what he expected me to acknowledge. He said I knew exactly what he meant. I always got to be the one everybody protected, and now I was acting shocked that he wanted one part of his life where he did not have to pretend. I reminded him that he had already removed me. I was not fighting for the seat. His pause was brief, but I heard it. Then he said, this was not about a seat. That was the first moment I understood. The wedding was not actually the prize. My absence was not enough. Evan wanted agreement. He wanted me to say the line he had drawn between family and me was not only his choice, but a fair one. He wanted the person he had excluded to certify the exclusion as reasonable. I did not give him that. I also did not tell him he had no right to be hurt, because I still did not understand what he believed had happened between us. I said only that if he wanted distance, he had it. I was not going to call relatives on his behalf and explain why I deserved a lesser place in our family. He ended the call by saying I was proving his point. For the rest of the day, I kept hearing that beside another sentence. You always got to be the one everyone protected. Until then, I had treated it as one more weapon he chose, because he knew it would hurt. But Mom's face at the kitchen table would not leave me alone. Neither would her silence when I asked why I was always expected to make peace. Something had shifted behind both moments. I just did not know what. That evening, Mom asked if she could come by alone. Her message was different from the ones she usually sent when she wanted to repair a fight. She did not tell me Evan was upset. She did not ask me to reconsider anything. She simply asked for 20 minutes and said there was something she should have told me a long time ago. When she arrived, she stood inside my doorway with her purse still over her shoulder. For once, she did not start by telling me we were family and everything would work out. She looked older than she had 3 days earlier. Megan, she said, there's something about those first years you lived with us that I think I understood wrong for a very long time. I let Mom in and waited for the kind of sentence families usually save for bad news. She sat at my kitchen table without taking off her coat. Her hands stayed folded around the strap of her purse for a moment, as if she needed something solid to hold while she decided where to begin. She started with me at 8 years old, not with foster care records or names I barely remembered, but with the things I had done after I came to live with them. I checked the front door before bed. I woke if I heard a car in the driveway. If Mom left to run an errand and was gone longer than I expected, I would sit where I could see the window and pretend I was not waiting. For months, I asked questions that sounded ordinary on the surface: what time dinner was, who was picking me up, whether I should unpack all my clothes, but underneath everyone was the same question. Am I still staying? I remembered pieces of it. I remembered studying Mom's face when she put on her shoes, trying to decide whether "I'll be back after lunch" was a promise or something adults said because children were easier when they believed it. Mom said she and Dad had been terrified of doing the wrong thing. They had wanted to make the house feel permanent before I had the courage to trust permanence. So when I panicked, they moved quickly. When I hesitated, they reassured me. When I needed one of them, they tried to make themselves available. None of that sounded wrong. That was why I did not understand why she looked so ashamed. Then she started telling me what happened around those moments. There had been a Saturday when Dad had promised Evan a day alone with him. I remembered the day because I had wanted to go too. In my memory, it had become proof that Dad loved me enough to include me. I had cried when I learned they were leaving without me, not because I cared where they were going, but because some frightened part of me had translated their closed car door into abandonment. Dad changed the plan. Instead of taking Evan alone, he took both of us. I had remembered the relief. Mom remembered Evan sitting in the back seat and not speaking. She reminded me of a birthday a year later when I woke already wound tight and spent half the morning convinced that too many people in the house meant I might be sent somewhere else afterward. The panic made no sense now, but it had been real then. Mom canceled part of the day, Dad stayed home, and the family plan shifted around me. What I had never known was that Evan had been promised an afternoon with friends that same day. Dad told him they would reschedule. The problem was not one canceled plan. It was the language that kept coming with those plans. You're older. You know you're ours. Your sister has already lost enough. Just let her have this one. Mom said the phrases slowly, as though hearing them from the other side for the first time. There had been dozens of small choices that seemed compassionate by themselves. Evan wanted the front seat. I was anxious, so I got it. Evan wanted time alone with Dad. I was having a hard week, so he was told there would be another day. He got angry. They reminded him that I had been through things he had not. And because he was 11, then 12, then 13, and because he had a bedroom he had slept in since he was a baby, they treated his security like an unlimited resource. I felt something cold settle under my ribs. I never asked you to do that, I said. Mom looked up immediately. I know. The answer should have relieved me. Instead, guilt found the opening anyway. It always did. I started going back through the years, sorting memories into a new set of columns. What had I needed? What had Evan lost because I needed it? How many family moments that felt like rescue to me had felt like subtraction to him? Mom must have seen where my mind was going because she reached across the table and covered my hand. She told me not to take responsibility for choices 2 adults made while trying to care for 2 children. She said I had been 8. If I was scared, I was allowed to be scared. If I needed reassurance, I was allowed to need it. Her voice broke when she added that Evan had been allowed to need things too. They just had not always treated it that way. For years, Mom and Dad had used Evan's lack of visible panic as evidence that he was fine. He did well in school. He had friends. He could stay at a friend's house without calling 3 times. When he was angry, he went quiet instead of falling apart. To my parents, that quiet looked like strength, so they gave him more of it. I thought of Evan at the wedding table saying, I had always been the one everybody protected. I had heard accusation in it. I still heard accusation. But now there was something else beneath it. Something I had not wanted to consider because the way he had spoken to me was so cruel. Maybe the sentence had not been invented for the wedding. Maybe he had been carrying it for 30 years. That realization did not make what he did acceptable. It did something more uncomfortable. It made him less simple. Dad arrived while Mom and I were still sitting at the table. He had apparently called twice while we were talking, and when Mom finally answered, she told him where she was. He came over because, as he put it, if they were going to talk about mistakes they made together, he did not want her carrying all of it alone. At first, though, he sounded like the man I knew. He said they had done the best they could with what they understood then. He reminded me there had been no handbook that could tell them how to help one frightened child without accidentally overlooking another. Mom did not argue with him. She only asked whether he remembered how often they described Evan as the easy one. Dad stopped. Evan was easy. Evan could handle disappointment. Evan could wait. Evan would get over it. Even after we were grown, the language remained. If he snapped at me during a holiday, everyone said he was stressed. If I reacted, someone would quietly ask me not to make things worse. Dad rubbed his hands over his face. Then he admitted there had been times he saw Evan withdraw and decided giving him space was the respectful thing to do. He thought silence meant the problem had passed. He thought a boy who did not ask twice had stopped needing the answer. I wanted a clean conclusion. Evan was wrong. I was right. He had used adoption as a weapon, and that should have been enough to put the entire moral weight on his side of the table. But childhood did not arrange itself that neatly. I could see myself at 8, frightened by a locked car door. I could also see an 11-year-old boy sitting behind me, learning that if I was frightened enough, whatever he wanted could be postponed. I hated that image because my mind immediately tried to turn it into blame. Maybe if I had been less needy. Maybe if I had adjusted faster. Maybe if I had not cried that Saturday. Mom stopped me before I could say any of it out loud. "We kept proving to you that you were staying," she said quietly. I think we forgot he might hear that as proof he was losing us. The words sat between us. I did not forgive Evan in that moment. I did not suddenly understand 34 years of bitterness. I did not even know whether Mom and Dad's memories matched his. What changed was smaller and harder. For the first time, I accepted that his feeling of being replaced might not have been something he invented just to wound me. Dad stood to leave, then stopped near the door. He looked back at me with an expression I rarely saw on him, the look of someone revisiting a moment he had once dismissed. He said he could not remember the exact words anymore, only the meaning. Evan had been around 13. There had been another argument about who needed Mom and Dad more. Afterward, Evan had said something like, if Megan needed them more that badly, maybe he should just learn not to need anybody. Dad had taken it for teenage anger. For more than 30 years, he had believed the boy would get over it. Standing in my kitchen, he finally admitted he was no longer sure Evan ever had. After Mom and Dad left, I stayed at my kitchen table long after the room went quiet. Their coffee cups were still there, one with a faint crescent of lipstick on the rim, and I kept looking at them as if some ordinary detail might tell me what I was supposed to do with everything I had just learned. For days, I had been angry at Evan for making my adoption sound like a stain. Now I was angry at him and aching for a boy I had never really known, even though I had lived down the hall from him for years. That was the part I could not settle. We had occupied the same house and carried different versions of it into adulthood. I remembered my first bedroom as the safest place I had ever slept. I remembered Mom sitting outside the door on nights when I could not bear to have it closed, pretending to sort laundry while I listened for the soft movement of her hands. I remembered Dad leaving the hallway light on even after I insisted I was too old to need it. Those memories were warm. They were proof that someone had noticed what frightened me and stayed. But now, Evan was in the edges of those memories too. I remembered one night when Mom sat outside my room until I fell asleep, and Evan came down the hall asking where the batteries were for something he was building. She shushed him before he finished the question. At the time, I had felt protected. Looking back, I could almost see his face when he turned away. I remembered a slice of chocolate cake left on a plate beside me after a family dinner during my first year in the house. I had assumed Mom saved it. Years later, she told me Evan had. He had left the room before I could thank him. There were small kindnesses I had never counted, because they did not fit the story I eventually told myself about him. There were also cruelties I could not erase, simply because I had found a reason for some of his anger. By high school, Evan knew exactly what the word adopted did to me when he used it in a fight. He had thrown it at me when we argued over a car, when Mom sided with me about a holiday plan, when he wanted to remind me that he had been in the family first. Sometimes his silence may have been hurt. Sometimes it was withdrawal. And sometimes, as he got older, he made a choice to put his hurt into my hands and make me carry it. Both things could be true. I kept repeating that to myself because my mind preferred extremes. Either Evan was cruel for no reason, which meant I could dismiss everything behind his anger, or he had a reason, which meant I should apologize for existing. I had spent too many years believing that gratitude required me to accept the second option whenever anyone was hurt by something connected to me. I took out a notebook and tried to write what I would say if Evan called again. My first attempt sounded like every peacekeeping speech I had ever given him. I'm sorry, things were hard after I came. I'm sorry you lost time with Mom and Dad. I'm sorry my needs changed your childhood. By the time I reached the fourth line, my chest had tightened. I crossed out the first sentence. Then the second. I could be sorry he hurt, without being sorry I was there. The distinction looked almost embarrassingly simple on paper, but emotionally, it felt like trying to separate two threads that had been knotted together for 34 years. I had not chosen foster care. I had not chosen to arrive at 8 years old, afraid of doors closing behind people. I had not decided Dad should cancel plans or Mom should tell Evan to be the strong one. I could wish my parents had handled those years differently, without wishing they had left me outside the family, so he would never have been inconvenienced by my presence. That realization did not make me feel triumphant. It made me sad. For him, for me. For two children who had each learned the wrong lesson from adults trying to do something loving. Later that afternoon, Mom called. Her voice was steadier than it had been at my table. She told me she and Dad had talked for hours after they got home. They had decided they needed to speak to Evan directly about those early years, not about the guest list, not to pressure him to invite me. They wanted to tell him they could see now that they had treated his ability to cope as permission to ask more from him. My stomach tightened anyway. The moment she said they planned to apologize, I imagined Evan hearing only the part he had been waiting for. "We chose Megan over you. You were right. She cost you your childhood." I told Mom exactly that. She said she understood the risk, but avoiding the conversation because Evan might misuse it would only repeat what Dad had done when he was 13, assuming silence was safer than listening. She and Dad were responsible for what they said and how clearly they said it. They could not control what Evan chose to do with it. That sounded reasonable. It also terrified the part of me that had spent years managing everybody else's reactions before they happened. I started offering suggestions. Maybe begin with the Saturday trip. Maybe avoid the word priority. Maybe make sure he knew they loved both of us. Halfway through, I heard myself and stopped. I was doing it again, editing the family into safety. Mom heard the change in my breathing. "You don't have to manage this for us," she said. I looked at the notebook in front of me, at the crossed-out apologies. "Then I won't." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was just unfamiliar. I did ask one thing. "Please don't apologize for bringing me home." Mom did not answer immediately. I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the table. "Apologize for the times you overlooked him. Apologize for making him be fine because I wasn't. Apologize for what you and Dad actually did. But don't make me the apology." Her voice softened. "We won't." That mattered more than I expected. For years, I had thought the safest way to keep my place was to volunteer myself as the explanation whenever the family hurt. If Evan was angry, I had probably pushed too hard. If Mom was stressed, I should need less. If Dad wanted peace, I should be the one who gave something up. Now my parents were preparing to face a mistake without asking me to become the mistake. I spent the next day trying not to imagine their conversation. I failed often. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected Evan. I went for a walk, came home, made dinner I barely tasted, and left my phone on the counter while I washed dishes so I would stop checking it every 30 seconds. I did not call Mom for an update. I did not ask Dad how Evan reacted. That restraint felt almost physical, like holding my hand away from a hot surface I had touched 1,000 times before. By evening, I understood something I had not been able to name the day before. Evan's childhood pain belonged in the story. It deserved to be seen. But seeing it did not require me to disappear from the same story. He had been a child who needed more than our parents realized. I had been a child who needed exactly what I needed. The failure was not that there had been 2 children in the house. The failure was that too often, the adults had acted as if only one child's needs could be urgent at a time. My phone rang just after 8. Evan's name lit the screen. For a moment, I stared at it. He had not called me since the day he crossed my name off the list. I expected anger. I expected an accusation. Some stubborn part of me even hoped that hearing Mom and Dad take responsibility might have changed the temperature between us. I answered. Evan did not say hello, so they finally admitted it. Evan said the sentence, like a man receiving a verdict he had waited 30 years to hear. There was no relief in his voice, no hesitation. If anything, he sounded steadier than he had at our parents' kitchen table, as though Mom and Dad's apology had given him something solid to stand on. I leaned against my counter and listened while he summarized their conversation in his own terms. They had admitted they prioritized me. They admitted they expected him to give things up because I had already lost enough. They admitted they treated him like the child who could wait. By the time he reached the end, every careful distinction Mom had described to me had been compressed into one conclusion. They had made him second. Every reflex I had practiced for years pushed me toward the same response. Soften it. Remind him they loved us both. Apologize before I knew what I was apologizing for. I let the silence sit instead. When I finally spoke, I said, "I think they did ask too much of you." He went quiet. I could almost feel him waiting for the rest. There had always been a rest, a qualification, a defense, a plea for peace. When I did not give him one, he asked whether I finally understood what he had been saying all these years. I told him I understood more than I had a week earlier. I understood that there were times Mom and Dad saw my fear and moved toward me so quickly that they failed to notice what their choice cost him. I understood that being called the strong one over and over could start to feel less like praise and more like a warning not to need anything. I told him I believed he had been hurt by that. For a moment, the silence between us felt almost human, still strained, but open enough for me to hope we were finally talking about the same wound. Then Evan said, "Good. Then you understand why I'm done pretending none of it matters." That was when I heard the turn. He did not stay with what had happened to him. He moved almost immediately to what he believed the past now entitled him to do. If Mom and Dad had finally acknowledged that my arrival changed his childhood, then in his mind, the wedding was simply the first place where he was refusing to keep paying for it. He said he was tired of being expected to act like our relationship had the same meaning as if we had grown up as normal siblings. He said everyone kept using the word sister, as though a word could erase the way the family had changed when I arrived. I let him finish. Some of what he said was true. My arrival had changed his childhood, and our parents had made choices that hurt him. What I could not accept was the step he kept taking after those facts, as if understanding the damage meant agreeing that I belonged lower in the family. I told him Mom and Dad should take responsibility for hurting him, and that they should have done it sooner. He agreed, but the pause that followed made clear he was waiting for something from me, too. I took a breath before I said the part I had written in my notebook and rewritten in my head for days. But I can't go back to being 8 years old and refuse to be adopted, so your childhood turns out differently. His voice hardened. That's not what I asked. It was close enough to what he wanted that I did not argue over the wording. I said I was not responsible for Dad canceling plans, or Mom telling him to be patient, or two adults deciding one child's fear was more urgent than another child's disappointment. I could regret the effect without pretending I had made those decisions. Evan said that was exactly how I always escaped responsibility. In his version of our family, I had spent my life receiving the benefits of everyone else's choices, while insisting I had no part in their cost. He said I got the extra reassurance, the extra chances, the extra patience, and now I wanted to keep the title of sister without admitting that the title had never meant the same thing to him. I felt the familiar sting of the word sister becoming conditional again, but underneath it was something new. I no longer needed to prove that every memory had been fair. I did not need to win the childhood argument, to know I had been a child inside it. He kept talking, less like a brother in a fight, and more like someone finally arranging the family into categories that made sense to him. Mom and Dad had chosen me, he said. He had already been theirs. They had brought me into an existing family, and then expected him to act grateful for the change. He said blood did not make him better than me, but history made us different, and he was done pretending that difference did not matter. The phrasing sounded reasonable until I heard what it was being used to justify. Different was not the problem. He wanted different to mean ranked. By then, I also understood what he had meant when he called me the family's biggest shame. There was no hidden disgrace behind the word. To Evan, the shame was that Mom and Dad had brought me in and still expected him to treat my place as equal to his. I asked one question. Do you want me to understand that you were hurt, or do you want me to agree that being hurt makes me less their daughter? He did not answer. I waited. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Somewhere outside, a car door closed. I remember those ordinary sounds because the silence on the phone felt more revealing than anything Evan had said. Finally, he told me I was twisting his words. I said I was trying to separate them. He accused me of reducing his entire childhood to a technicality. I told him I was doing the opposite. I was taking his pain seriously enough not to confuse it with a license to define my place in the family. That angered him more than denial would have. Denial was familiar. He knew how to fight it. What he did not seem prepared for was being believed about the wound and refused on the verdict. His voice rose for the first time. He reminded me that I had spent years benefiting from Mom and Dad's guilt. I reminded him, quietly, that I had spent those same years being a child who was afraid she could be sent away. Neither experience canceled the other. Then he said something that made the real shape of the conflict impossible to ignore. If you actually understood, you wouldn't keep insisting on being treated exactly the same. There it was. That was when his real demand came into focus. He did not just want me to acknowledge the wound. He wanted the wound to justify a smaller place for me. I did not tell him that in those words. A speech would not have helped. I said only that I could recognize what he lost, without agreeing that I owed him a smaller life in return. He laughed once, without humor, and said that was why talking to me was impossible. I always found a way to sound compassionate while refusing to own my part. Own my part stayed with me. I could admit that I had sometimes been protected at his expense, and that as an adult I had often gone along with the family habit of smoothing things over. What I could not own was being 8 years old and needing a home. Evan must have heard that I was not going to say what he wanted, because his tone shifted again. He became controlled, almost practical. He said the wedding was still days away. He said he was not unreasonable. If I could finally acknowledge my part without turning it into another accusation against him, there might still be a way for me to attend without making the day about me. A week earlier, those words would have made my heart jump. An opening, a chance to fix it, a path back to the family. I asked what exactly he wanted me to acknowledge. He said we could discuss that properly, not over the phone. Then he added that Mom and Dad should hear it too, because they had spent years protecting me from the truth. Julia should be there because she deserved to know whether I could respect his boundaries before the wedding. I did not agree. I did not refuse. I told him I needed time to think. He ended the call with the same calm certainty he had started with, as though the existence of a possible invitation meant he was offering generosity rather than terms. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen and understood that the story had changed again. A few days earlier, I had wanted to know whether Evan's pain was real. Now I knew it was. The harder question was, what happened when a real wound became a permanent claim on someone else's place in the family? The answer came the next morning in a text from him, 3 days before the wedding. Mom and Dad, you and me, Julia too. If you can finally be honest, I'll put your name back. The message had arrived 3 days before the wedding. The meeting itself was for the following afternoon. I had read it often enough that I no longer saw only the promise to put my name back. A week earlier, that would have been the part that mattered: the family table, the photographs, the relief of walking into the ceremony as though nothing had happened. Now the offer felt less like a door opening than a price I had not yet been told. I did not reply immediately. I went to work, answered emails, ate half a sandwich at my desk, and kept finding the message on my screen whenever my attention slipped. Part of me wanted to refuse the meeting because I could already feel its shape. Evan would call it honesty. Mom and Dad would become anxious. Julia would be pulled into a family argument she had not created. I would be expected to prove I could hear his pain without objecting to whatever conclusion he attached to it. Avoiding all of that sounded peaceful. But avoidance had also been part of our family language for years. Dad waited for anger to pass. Mom asked me to smooth things over. I tried to become easy enough that no one had to say what they really meant. If I skipped the conversation entirely, I would protect myself from one difficult evening, but I would also leave the central question untouched. Evan had told me he wanted more than distance. I needed to know whether there was any version of reconciliation he could imagine that did not require me to become less. That evening, I told him I would come. I added one boundary. I would not sit through a trial of my adoption, and I would not participate in any conversation where Mom and Dad were asked to choose one child over the other. He responded with a thumbs-up reaction. No agreement in words, no objection either. It was such a small thing, but I noticed how much I wanted the symbol to mean more than it did. Mom called less than an hour later. She had clearly been waiting to hear whether I accepted. Her first instinct was still protection. She said if Evan used the meeting to humiliate me again, she did not know how she could walk into his wedding 2 days later and pretend everything was fine. I heard the anger beneath her voice, but I also heard the old family system trying to reverse itself. For years, Evan had experienced my needs as a reason he lost something. Now Mom was ready to make my pain the reason he lost his parents' presence at his wedding. "Please don't do that," I said. She started to argue that there had to be consequences. I agreed there did, but I told her consequences were not the same as making his wedding another contest over which child mattered more. "If you stay home because of me, he'll only hear that I took one more thing from him." Mom went quiet. I knew the sentence hurt because it echoed the story Evan had carried for years, but I was not saying he was right about me. I was saying they could confront what he had done without making his wedding the next thing he lost because I was hurting. They could tell him he was wrong and refuse to let him insult me. They did not need to prove that by choosing me over him. Dad was harder. He called the next morning with the blunt energy of someone who had spent too many days feeling guilty and had converted part of that guilt into anger. He said Evan was twisting an apology that had been offered in good faith, and somebody needed to put him back in his place. Years ago, hearing Dad speak that way on my behalf would have felt like victory. I would have wanted Evan to know Dad chose me. Instead, it made me tired. I told Dad I did not want him using parental authority to win an argument that had already been built around rank. Evan was a grown man. Dad could tell him what he regretted and what he would no longer accept. But if he walked into the meeting determined to defeat him, Evan would hear only another version of the same message. Someone had to lose for someone else to feel loved. Dad exhaled heavily. "So, what are we supposed to do?" "For once," I said, "maybe nobody has to win." It was not a perfect answer. I did not have one. What I had was a growing list of things I refused to keep doing. Begging, translating, apologizing for being there, or accepting love that had to be measured against someone else's. Julia called that afternoon. Her voice was careful, but not suspicious, the way it had been when she first asked whether I planned to disrupt the wedding. She said Evan told her about the meeting and that he wanted everyone there, so there would be no disagreement later about what had been said. I braced myself for another request to explain our history. It did not come. Julia said, "I don't need you to tell me some secret about him." I almost laughed from surprise. There was no secret to tell. She went on to say she had heard enough versions of the conflict through Evan and did not want to keep being used as a messenger. If the four of us had something to say, she wanted to hear it directly in the same room. That was all. I told her I understood. I did not ask whether she believed me. I did not ask what Evan had told her since our last call. I did not try to recruit her. When we hung up, I realized that was another small change in me. A week ago, I would have wanted the bride to confirm that I was reasonable because her approval might have felt like proof I was not the problem. Now I was grateful only that she was willing to listen without turning herself into a judge. Late that day, Evan sent another message. This one was longer and arranged almost like terms for a meeting. He said there were 3 things he needed acknowledged before we could move forward. My arrival had changed his childhood. Mom and Dad had prioritized my needs over his more than once, and he had the right to set boundaries around his own wedding. I sat on my couch and read the list slowly. The first statement was true. My arrival had changed his childhood because families change when another child enters them. The second was also true in the specific way Mom and Dad had already admitted. There had been times they asked him to wait, yield, or need less because I was struggling. The third was true too, at least on its face. It was his wedding. He could decide whom to invite. I had said that from the beginning. What made the message difficult was not the 3 statements themselves. It was the conclusion I sensed behind them. I opened the notebook I had used earlier in the week and made 2 short columns. I could acknowledge change, lost time, and Evan's right to control his guest list. I could not call my adoption a wrongdoing, say I was less Carolyn Thomas's daughter, or let his wedding boundary decide what I was outside the wedding. That was the loom I needed to carry into the meeting. That evening, Mom texted to ask if I still planned to go. I told her yes. Then, after a few minutes, another message appeared from her. She had forwarded something Evan had sent to her instead of to me. If she can say one sentence in front of all of us, she can come to the wedding. I stared at it, feeling the invitation change shape one more time. It was no longer a card, a chair, or a name on a list. It was something I was apparently expected to purchase with a sentence. I called Mom. What sentence? There was a pause on the line, and Mom did not answer right away. Mom finally answered by saying she did not want to repeat Evan's sentence for him. He had sent her the condition, but he had also insisted that if I was going to hear it, I should hear it from him with everyone present. 2 days before the wedding, that distinction felt almost absurdly formal. Still, I understood why she hesitated. Whatever he wanted me to say had become more than a private apology. He wanted witnesses. The meeting happened that afternoon at my parents' house. It was shorter and quieter than the family arguments I had imagined all week. No one sat at the kitchen table where Evan had crossed out my name. Mom chose the living room instead, as if changing rooms might keep us from repeating the same scene. Dad stood by the window until I asked him to sit down. Julia arrived with Evan and took the chair nearest the door. She looked tired, not hostile. The wedding was 48 hours away, and there were probably 100 other things she could have been doing. I reminded myself that she was there because Evan had asked her to witness what he called honesty, not because she had volunteered to judge me. Evan did not waste time. He said the 3 points he had already sent me were not enough because I kept agreeing with the facts and rejecting what they meant. Then he told me there was one sentence that would prove I finally understood him. He wanted me to say, in front of our parents and Julia, that being brought into the Hale family had cost him part of his childhood, and that I understood why he did not see me as a real sister, in the same way blood family was real. For a few seconds, no one moved. The first half of the sentence hurt because I could no longer dismiss it. A week earlier, I would have fought the wording. I would have said I had not taken anything, that I had been 8, that I had never asked Dad to cancel a Saturday, or Mom to tell Evan to be patient. All of those things were still true. But I also knew now that his childhood had changed when I arrived, and some of those changes had cost him time, attention, and the feeling that his needs would be noticed without becoming an emergency first. So I told him that. I said I believed he had lost real things. I believed there were days when Mom and Dad had asked him to wait because I was frightened, and that enough days like that could teach a child that waiting was his permanent role. I believed he had felt unseen. I did not argue about which memory was worse or whether he remembered every detail the same way I did. I did not need to. Evan listened without interrupting. For the first time in days, there was nowhere for him to put the accusation that I refused to hear him. Then I told him I would not say the rest. His face changed almost immediately. The softness, if that was what it had been, disappeared. He asked why I could admit that my arrival changed his life, but still refused to acknowledge what that meant about us, because the two statements were not the same thing. I told him his pain did not make my adoption a mistake. It did not turn 34 years of being Carol and Thomas's daughter into a temporary arrangement, and it did not give him the right to decide that real sister was a title I could lose whenever he needed his childhood to make sense. Evan called that another escape from responsibility. He said I wanted all the compassion in the world for what I had been through at 8, while refusing to accept that he had been 11 and had no choice either. That part landed because it was true. He had not chosen the situation either. He had not invited a frightened child into his home and then designed the way our parents responded. But the truth did not lead where he wanted it to lead. I believe you were hurt, I said. I'm not arguing with that. I stopped there. I could feel another sentence behind it, something larger that I was not ready to say yet. The room did not need a speech. It needed a boundary. I told him I could not make his pain disappear by agreeing that I was less real. If he needed distance from me, he could have distance. If he did not want me at his wedding, I would respect that. But I would not purchase a chair by repeating a sentence that made my place in the family conditional. Dad pushed forward in his seat. His anger had been building in silence. He said if that was the price of my invitation, then maybe there was no reason for him to be at the wedding either. Mom immediately agreed that she did not know how she was supposed to sit in the front row after hearing Evan reduce me to something less than his sister. For one dangerous second, a part of me felt relief. There it was again, the old desire in a new costume. Choose me, prove it. Let him finally know what it feels like to lose something because of me. The feeling passed through me fast enough to frighten me. No, I said. Dad looked at me as if I had misunderstood him. Mom started to explain that they were not punishing Evan for me. They were setting a boundary. But I had spent the last week learning how easily a boundary could become a weapon when its real purpose was to force someone else to feel a loss. If you stay home for me, I said, we're doing the same thing all over again. We're making one child lose something so the other one can feel loved. No one spoke. I told Mom and Dad I was not asking them to approve of what Evan had done. I just did not want his wedding turned into another proof of who mattered more. They had already apologized for asking him to give things up whenever I was hurting. Staying home now would repeat the same lesson with the names reversed. Dad's jaw tightened, but he leaned back. Mom looked down at her hands. Across the room, Julia had barely spoken. I saw her glance at Evan, then at me, when I told my parents to attend. She did not praise me. She did not announce that she finally understood who was right. Her silence was enough. She had just watched me refuse, the easiest way to make myself the injured center of the wedding. Evan seemed almost more frustrated by that than by my refusal to repeat his sentence. He said I was trying to make myself look morally superior. I told him I was not trying to look better than him. I was done fighting over the seat. Then I made the decision I had been circling since he first crossed my name off the list. I told him I would not accept a conditional invitation. If my name could go back on the guest list only after I agreed that his pain made me a lesser sister, then he could leave it off. I was not asking him to reconsider. I was not asking Mom or Dad to boycott. I was not asking Julia to intervene. The chair was his to offer, and mine to refuse. The words hurt more than I expected. Some stubborn part of me had still imagined a normal-looking ending. My dress, the family photographs, a polite hug, everyone exhausted but present. Saying no meant giving up that picture on purpose. It meant accepting that there might be no ceremony, where Evan suddenly looked at me and saw the sister I had spent decades trying to prove I was. But once I said it, the invitation lost its power over me. Evan could no longer threaten to take away something I had stopped asking him to return. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Mom hugged me in the hallway. Dad told me he and Mom would attend the wedding, though he did not sound happy about it. Julia left with Evan after a quiet goodbye. I went home feeling grief more than victory. That night, a message from Evan appeared on my phone. He said the invitation was no longer the issue. He wanted one final conversation the next evening, before the wedding, to settle what family means before tomorrow. A minute later, Julia replied in the same group thread. She would be there. By the time I returned to my parents' house the night before the wedding, the guest list no longer mattered to me. There were no papers on the table and no seat left to bargain over. Mom and Dad were already in the living room. Julia arrived with Evan a few minutes later. He looked exhausted but certain. The difference from the previous afternoon was immediate. Nobody was negotiating an invitation. Evan said that part was over. What he wanted now was an answer about whether Mom and Dad could admit how often they had put my needs first and still insist we were equally their children. He laid out the chain he had been building all week. Our parents had asked too much of him. I had admitted those choices hurt him, and therefore, he believed, everyone should stop criticizing him for drawing a line around family. Listening to him, I could hear why the argument had carried him this far. Each step began with something true. But the last step still asked everyone else to let his pain decide my place. I let him finish, without correcting old details or reminding him how often he had used the word adopted to hurt me. We were past the guest list now. I believe you were hurt, I said. I believe Mom and Dad made choices that cost you things. But I was a child too. I didn't make those choices, and I won't spend the rest of my life paying for them." The room stayed quiet after I said it. I had imagined those words so many times that I expected some rush of triumph when they finally came out. Instead, I felt sad. They were not a victory speech. They were an admission that compassion had a limit when someone tried to turn it into a debt. Evan looked at me for a long moment, and then shifted toward our parents. If I was not going to accept his conclusion, he wanted them to explain theirs. He asked how they could say we were equally their children when they had repeatedly chosen my needs over his. He reminded them that they were the ones who had taught him to wait, to be older, to understand. If all of that had been wrong, he wanted to know why the correction now seemed to stop exactly where my status began. Mom's face tightened. She did not defend herself. That mattered. A week earlier, she might have said they had only been trying to help me, or that Evan was rewriting the past. Instead, she told him they had failed him in specific ways. They had mistaken security for invulnerability. They had expected him to carry disappointment because he seemed more capable of carrying it. She said she was sorry for that, and would remain sorry, even if he never forgave her. Then she said the part he did not want. Their mistake did not make me less their daughter. Evan's jaw shifted. He asked, why not? If their choices had damaged him, why was everyone so determined to separate the person who benefited from those choices from the damage they caused? I felt the old reflex stir, the urge to answer for Mom before she could say something that made him angrier. I let it pass. Dad spoke instead. His voice was quieter than I expected. He said he had spent years believing Evan's silence meant resilience because that interpretation was easier than asking whether his son had stopped expecting to be heard. He owned that. He also said he had spent the past week discovering another mistake. Every time conflict rose between us as adults, he still looked for the fastest way to make it stop. Usually that meant expecting me to bend and Evan to cool off. He had called that peace because no one was shouting. Evan asked whether Dad was saying the family had failed both of us. Dad said yes. That answer did not satisfy him. I could see why. If the failure belonged to the parents, and both children had been hurt in different ways, then there was no longer a simple ladder with Evan above me, or me above him. There was only responsibility, grief, and a relationship he would have to choose what to do with now. He stood and paced once toward the window. When he turned back, he said he was tired of everyone hiding behind balance. He had spent his childhood being told my needs mattered more because I had lost more. Now, the first time he asked the family to acknowledge what that had done to him, everyone suddenly discovered equality. Then he looked directly at Mom and Dad. "Then choose," he said. "Who is your child when it actually costs you something?" Dad moved before anyone else. His chair scraped against the floor, and anger flashed across his face. I knew that look. He was about to answer the question on Evan's terms, to defend me by making Evan feel the force of being rejected. I reached out and caught Dad's wrist. "No." He looked down at my hand, then at me. "Both of us," I said. That was always supposed to be the answer. Nothing was fixed by that answer. Evan did not agree, and Mom and Dad still had years of mistakes to face, but I no longer felt trapped inside his question. For most of my life, some part of me had believed family love was a room with limited chairs. I had been brought into that room at 8 years old and spent decades making sure no one regretted giving me one. Evan had spent the same decades believing my chair had been taken from him. We had both allowed that arithmetic to survive long after childhood. I was done doing the math. I told Evan I would not be at the wedding the next day. Not because he had won. Not because I agreed I was less his sister. And not because I wanted my absence to punish him. I would not go because I was no longer willing to enter a room where my relationship to my own parents had to be negotiated as the admission price. He said I was making a dramatic point out of something that should have been simple. Maybe once I would have tried to prove I was not dramatic. I would have softened my words, promised I was happy for him, asked him not to misunderstand. This time I let him misunderstand if he needed to. Only then did I understand why crossing his name out had mattered to me. I had answered his gesture instead of shrinking beneath it. Whatever Evan believed about me, I did not have to keep handing him the final say. Mom wiped at her eyes but did not ask us to hug. Dad sat back down. Neither of them tried to force a reconciliation. That restraint felt like its own kind of apology. Julia had been silent through most of the conversation. She had not corrected Evan, defended me, or announced a verdict. But I watched her expression change when he asked our parents to choose. It was the first time the conflict stopped looking like an old sibling wound and became a present-day method. If someone loved him, they were expected to prove it by taking something away from someone else. Evan turned to her near the end and asked whether she had anything to say. Julia looked tired more than angry. She told him she was not going to decide who counted as family for the Hale family, and she was not going to cancel the wedding in the middle of a fight that had started decades before she met any of us. Then she stood. "Tomorrow can still happen," she said. "But this cannot be how we solve every conflict in our marriage." No one answered. Julia picked up her bag and left the room before Evan did. I woke before my alarm on the morning of Evan's wedding and reached for my phone before I was fully awake. The screen was dark. For one stupid second, disappointment hit me so quickly that I almost laughed at myself. Some old part of me had expected a message waiting there. "Come anyway. We changed our minds. Forget everything. There is still a place for you." I had spent days saying I was done bargaining for a seat, and apparently my nervous system had not received the announcement. I lay there staring at the ceiling and let the feeling pass without turning it into a decision. No message did not mean I had been erased. A message would not have restored anything that mattered. The dress I had bought for the wedding was still hanging in my closet. I saw the edge of the garment bag when I opened the door for a sweater, and that was harder than I expected. I had imagined wearing it in family photographs, standing beside Mom and Dad, smiling through whatever awkwardness Evan and I managed to contain for one afternoon. I did not take the dress out. I also did not shove it to the back like evidence of a humiliation I needed to punish myself for. I closed the closet and made coffee. That small act felt more honest than either extreme. The day was happening without me. I was allowed to be sad about that without using the sadness as proof that I did not belong anywhere. By mid-morning, the urge to check my phone had changed shape. I wondered whether relatives were discussing my absence, whether someone had asked Mom where I was, whether Evan had told a new version of the story now that the wedding day had arrived. I could have found out easily. There were group threads I could open, social pages I could search, people I could text under the excuse of wishing them a good day. A week earlier, I would have called that staying informed. In truth, I had spent years using other people's reactions as a measuring device. If they defended me, I felt safer. If they were quiet, I wondered what I had done wrong. If they chose Evan's version, I wanted to explain harder. That morning, I put my phone on the kitchen counter and walked away from it. Mom called shortly before the ceremony. I knew where she was without asking. Her voice had the soft, distracted sound of someone standing in a hallway while people moved around her. I could hear faint noise in the background, but she did not narrate the wedding to me. She did not tell me who had noticed my absence or whether Evan seemed angry. Most importantly, she did not ask me to change my mind. "I just wanted to tell you I love you," she said. "We'll call later." I closed my eyes. The sentence would have frightened me once, because later might have sounded like being left behind. Instead, I heard what she was actually saying. She was going to be present for her son on his wedding day, and she was not asking her daughter to disappear emotionally so she could do it. "I love you too," I said. "Go be with him, Mom." There was a little catch in her breath before she said okay. We ended the call without solving anything. A few minutes later, Dad sent a text. "Love you. Thinking of you. We'll talk after." That was all. No speech about Evan, no promise to confront him after the ceremony, no report about who was sitting where. I read it twice, smiled despite myself, and sent back, "Love you too. Have a good day." Then I set the phone down again. Something loosened in me after that. For the first time in years, my parents were somewhere important with Evan, and I was not translating their presence into a verdict about me. They could love him that day without loving me less. They could stand beside him in photographs without pushing me outside the family. It sounded obvious when I put it into words, but my life had not always felt obvious. At 8, I had learned to watch doors. As an adult, I had learned to watch people. Who called first, who defended whom, who sat beside whom, who made room. I had treated belonging like something that could change every time the seating changed. I did not want to live that way anymore. I kept the rest of the day ordinary on purpose. I went out for groceries, took a longer route home, cleaned my kitchen, and finally finished a book I had been carrying from room to room for weeks. None of it was dramatic. That was the relief. I did not spend the afternoon imagining a scene at the ceremony where someone stood up and denounced Evan. I did not picture Julia walking away from the altar. I did not secretly hope Mom and Dad would leave early to prove a point. The wedding did not need to collapse for my boundary to be real. Once that afternoon, I almost opened the family thread for a photograph, then set the phone down. I could look later. I did not need to measure my absence in real time. Mom called that evening, after the ceremony, but before the night was fully over. She sounded tired and emotional. She did not offer me a report card on anyone's behavior. She simply told me that Evan and Julia were married. The ceremony had happened, and everyone had made it through the day. I told her I was glad. I meant it. Not in the polished way I had often said I was fine when I was not, but in the quieter sense that I did not need disaster to balance the scales. Evan had hurt me. He had still gotten married. Both facts could exist without one canceling the other. Dad got on the phone for less than a minute. He said they would see me soon, and that he was proud of how I had handled these past 12 days. I almost told him not to praise me for being the calm one. Then I realized that was not what he meant. He was not rewarding me for absorbing Evan's anger. He was acknowledging that I had refused to make the wedding a punishment. I thanked him and let the compliment stay where it belonged. Later that night, I made tea and finally looked at my phone without bracing for impact. There were a few harmless messages from relatives and no crisis waiting for me. Then Evan's name appeared. "You got what you wanted. They spent my wedding worrying about you." The sentence was so familiar in structure that I felt my body react before my mind did. There it was again. If Mom and Dad loved me, something had been taken from him. If they thought about me while standing beside him, I had stolen part of his day without even being there. For years, I would have answered immediately. I would have explained that I told them to attend. I would have reminded him that I had not called during the ceremony. I would have listed all the ways I had tried not to interfere until I had built a legal defense against an accusation no amount of explanation could satisfy. My fingers moved toward the keyboard, then stopped. I did not need to correct his story that night. He had just married the woman he loved. My parents had shown up for him. I had stayed away. If he still needed to turn those facts into a competition, that was no longer a problem I could solve by producing better evidence. So I did not answer. The silence felt different from Dad's old silence, the kind that hoped a problem would disappear if nobody touched it. Mine was a boundary. Evan knew what I believed. I had said it to his face. There was nothing left to clarify at midnight after his reception. 3 days later, Mom sent me a message. "Your brother asked us a question he has never asked before, whether we ever noticed what he needed back then." I let Mom's message sit on the screen for a while. A week earlier, I would have wanted to know exactly what Evan had said, what tone he used, and whether Mom thought it meant he was finally changing. This time, I took it for what it was. The first question he had asked about his own childhood instead of another accusation about me. It mattered, but it did not erase anything that had happened. Over the next few weeks, Mom gave me small updates when we talked, but for the first time, she did not turn those updates into assignments for me. She and Dad had spoken with Evan more than once. The conversations were not about getting us back into the same room. They were not about whether I should call him, whether he should apologize, or whether everyone could manage a holiday without tension. They asked him about himself. What had he needed when he was 12 and stopped asking Dad for time alone? What had he heard when they told him he was the strong one? What did he remember about the years when being easy became the safest role in the house? Mom said some of the conversations went badly. Evan still returned to me sometimes, insisting that none of those choices would have happened if I had not arrived. But Mom and Dad were learning not to follow him there. They apologized for what they had done, not for bringing me home. Dad told him he was sorry for assuming silence meant resilience. Mom told him she was sorry for repeatedly asking him to be generous when what he sometimes needed was permission to be disappointed. They did not ask him to excuse them. They also did not let his pain turn me into the explanation for every mistake. That mattered to me more than any dramatic reconciliation could have. Healing, if Evan ever chose it, no longer required me to stand in the middle translating everyone's intentions. My parents could face what they had done without using me as evidence that they were good people. Evan could be angry without my being summoned to calm him. I could care about what happened without being responsible for making it end well. I noticed I had stopped asking Mom how each conversation ended. When she mentioned that she and Dad were seeing Evan again, I could simply say I hoped it went well and move on. I was not waiting outside their conversations anymore, listening for my name. The change in Mom and Dad showed up in quieter ways, too. One Sunday, Mom called and mentioned that she and Evan had argued the night before. I braced without meaning to. My body knew the old script before my mind did. She would tell me he was upset. She would ask me to reach out. She would say I was better at talking to him when he got like this. Instead, she sighed and said, "We'll work it out with him." That was all. I waited for the request that never came. A few days later, Dad stopped by with a container Mom had sent over. We drank coffee at my table, and he admitted that he and Mom had relied on me as the family peacemaker because I almost always accepted the job. He said they had mistaken my willingness to bend for proof that bending did not cost me anything. I told him I had helped teach them that too. For years, being useful had felt safer than being difficult. If I could make everyone comfortable, I did not have to wonder whether they regretted making room for me. Dad looked down at his cup. We should have known better. Maybe they should have. Maybe I should have learned sooner. I was no longer interested in deciding who deserved the largest share of blame. Responsibility mattered. Ranking it did not. 2.5 weeks after the wedding, Evan texted me. I saw his name on the screen and felt the familiar tightening in my stomach, but it passed faster than before. His message was short. "I'm not ready to pretend none of this happened." I almost smiled at the strange honesty of it. For once, he was not accusing me of ruining something or asking me to certify his version of the past. He was also not apologizing. I did not need to turn the message into more than it was. I answered after thinking for a while. I told him I was not asking him to pretend. I was not ready to pretend either. What happened had happened. Mom and Dad had made mistakes. He had been hurt. He had also used that hurt to tell me I was less real, and I would not build any future relationship on that condition. Then I wrote the sentence I wished I had understood years earlier. If we ever had a relationship again, I could not keep paying for the right to exist in it. He did not reply for the next 2 days, and I let the silence be his to manage. The consequence Evan had demanded at the kitchen table had become real, just not in the way he imagined. He had said he would rather be an only child than admit I was his sister. I was no longer trying to force him to use the word, but that meant he no longer had the version of me who called after every fight, softened every holiday, or accepted a smaller place to preserve the appearance of closeness. The sibling relationship he insisted was unequal had, for now, become almost no relationship at all. There was sadness in that. There was also honesty. Julia texted me once during those weeks. Her message was brief enough that I read it in less than a minute. She said the wedding had not been canceled, obviously, and she was not contacting me to reopen the family argument. She only wanted me to know that what she said the night before the wedding still stood. She and Evan would have to learn how to disagree without turning conflict into a test of who loved whom more. I thanked her for telling me. I did not ask what Evan had said about me since the wedding. I did not ask whether they were fighting, whether she regretted marrying him, or whether she thought he would change. Those were questions about a marriage I was not inside. Julia had told me what belonged to me, and I left the rest with her. By the 4th week, nothing was neat. Evan and I were still distant. Mom still cried sometimes over the years she wished she could redo, and Dad still caught himself trying to change the subject when a conversation became uncomfortable. The difference was that he stayed in it. But the machinery had changed. Nobody asked me to call Evan or asked Evan to approve my place in the family. Mom and Dad had stopped treating love like something they had to prove to one child by withholding it from the other. One evening, I stopped by my parents' house for dinner. It was ordinary leftovers, Dad complaining about a cabinet hinge, Mom insisting he had been about to fix it for 6 months. When I was leaving, Mom handed me a small container with my name, written across a strip of masking tape on the lid in her familiar handwriting, Megan. I stood in their kitchen for a second, longer than necessary, looking at it. My name, nothing ceremonial, nothing legally important, not printed on a guest list or placed under a category labeled immediate family. Just 5 letters on a container Mom wanted returned someday because she knew I was taking it home. At 8 years old, I had watched doors because I needed to know whether I was staying. At 42, I had spent too much time watching names, chairs, photographs, invitations, and other people's reactions for the same reason. Somewhere along the way, I had confused being included with being secure. The wedding had finally broken that habit open. Evan had crossed my name off one list. What he never understood was that I had finally stopped letting him hold the pen.